The global conservation movement stands at a critical juncture, torn between perpetuating colonial patterns of environmental management and embracing radical new paradigms centered on indigenous sovereignty. Dawson, Longo, and Survival International's Decolonize Conservation, Global Voices for Indigenous Self-Determination, Land, and a World in Common 2023 offers a searing indictment of what the authors term fortress conservation, the practice of creating protected natural areas through displacement of indigenous communities. Through my theological lens as a South Carolina student engaged in ecological and spiritual work, three fundamental tensions emerge. One, the contradiction between conservation's stated ecological goals and its colonial implementation methods. Two, the theological implications of separating human stewardship from natural ecosystems. Three, the urgent need for conservation models that center indigenous cosmovisions while addressing climate crisis realities. This video will analyze these tensions through key passages from the text, while proposing pathways for transformative ecological action rooted in both local context and global solidarity. 1. Historical foundations of fortress conservation. The myth of pristine wilderness. The text reveals how early American conservationists like John Muir propagated the dangerous myth that true wilderness required the absence of indigenous peoples, describing national parks as Edenic, wild gardens purged of native inhabitants. Dawson et al. 2023-12. This artificial separation of humanity from nature, or what the authors call the idea that nature is separate from humanity. 22, stems from Western dualistic thinking that our theology must confront the Christian tradition's historical complicity in this separation through doctrines of domination. Genesis 1:28 demands critical re-examination in light of indigenous cosmologies that view humans as part of creation's web. 2. Conservation as continuation of colonial violence. Militarized conservation practices in Africa and Asia follow the same logic as 19th century American frontier policies. The text documents how 65,000 elephants per year were slaughtered in Africa during colonial occupation. 28, followed by conservation policies that continued displacing communities under ecological pretexts. Contemporary green militarization, funded through organizations like UZ49, creates security states where indigenous peoples face surveillance and violence, while industrial extractors operate with impunity. This pattern mirrors South Carolina's history, where enslaved Africans cultivated rice plantations that later became wildlife preserves, erasing both ecological and human histories. 3. Theological implications of conservation paradigms. Stewardship versus dominion in ecological theology. The text's critique of conservation models that prevent destruction of nature without addressing what's wrong with the societies that destroy it. 22 challenges mainstream environmental theology. A decolonial rereading of stewardship. Genesis 2:15 must reject both exploitative dominion and paternalistic conservation, instead embracing indigenous models like the Congo Basin's community forestry, where local people manage and patrol their own territories. 149. The authors note that indigenous people have been leading conservation efforts for ages. 79, suggesting our theological frameworks should follow rather than manage these traditions. Sacramental ecology and land sovereignty. When the text states that naturalizing places is nothing other than dehumanization. 28, it echoes sacramental theology's insistence on the sacredness of material reality. The violent separation of indigenous peoples from ritual landscapes, like the forced removal from South Carolina's sacred Catawba sites, constitutes a theological crisis. True sacramental ecology requires land repatriation. What Tuck and Young in their work, Decolonization is not a metaphor, call the elimination of settler property rights and sovereignty. 13. Not just symbolic inclusion in conservation efforts. Roman 4. Climate crisis and false solutions. The failure of market-based conservation. The text exposes how carbon offset schemes and 30 by 30 inches protected area initiatives serve as false solutions, providing social license for the growth maximizing paradigm. 91-92. In South Carolina, this manifests in examples such as coastal blue carbon projects that displace Gullah Geechee communities, while allowing continued fossil fuel extraction inland, as well as real estate development practices that push rural and indigenous communities here from generations of land use. The author's documentation of offset-related land grabs. 92 warns against embracing market mechanisms without sovereignty protections. Indigenous leadership in climate adaptation. Contrasting fortress conservation's failures, the text presents living alternatives. In the Congo Basin, community-managed forests show higher biodiversity than state-controlled parks. 141-142. For coastal South Carolina facing rising seas, the Gullah Geechee's historic land management practices, tidal rice cultivation, oyster reef restoration offer climate resilience models predating colonial disruption. As the authors state, solutions must make indigenous peoples integral through traditional knowledge. 81. a principle applicable from Congolese rainforests to low-country marshes. 5. Pathways for transformative action. Reparative ecological praxis. Moving beyond analytical criticism, the text calls for return of stolen land, respect for sovereignty, and radical transformation of co-colonialism 14. Practically, this demands that South Carolina institutions a. Transfer conserved land titles to indigenous nations like the Catawba, Waccamaw, and PD who retain their cultural identities in the Palmetto State despite being displaced. B. Replace larger nonprofit or NGO-led conservation efforts that have shortchanged local communities by working in colonialist and capitalistic structures in the guise of progress with community-directed ecological plans. C. Redirect conservation funding from militarization to indigenous land management training. Theological education as decolonial practice. The author's observation that donors display profound lack of awareness of ground realities 142 often applies equally to academic theology or interfaith discussions. Our curriculum must center indigenous ecological knowledge through inclusion of indigenous land ethics rather than solely relying on wilderness spirituality texts with indigenous land ethics. Field education at sites of conservation conflict like the Atlantic Coast Pipeline or golf course development sites, as well as the State House in Columbia. Conclusion and reflection. This engagement with decolonized conservation reveals that ecological justice cannot be separated from land sovereignty. For my context in South Carolina, this means confronting how our own areas of colonialist development occupies indigenous land and how our conservation partnerships may perpetuate displacement in the 21st century. Final reflection. How might our theological institutions function differently if indigenous land sovereignty became the starting point rather than an addendum to ecological efforts? What spiritual practices could help settlers like myself sit with the discomfort of this paradigm shift? They tried to bury us in parks and plantations. They didn't know we were seeds. Adaptation of a Zapatista saying through the lens of decolonial conservation, based on a poem by Dinos Christianopoulos. References. Primary text. Dawson, Ashley, Fior Longo, and Survival International. 2023. Decolonize Conservation. Global Voices for Indigenous Self-Determination, Land, and a World in Common. New York, Common Notions. Key theoretical works cited. Tuck, Eve, and K. Wayne Young, 2012. Decolonization is not a metaphor. Decolonization, Indigeneity, Education and Society 140. Contextual sources for South Carolina applications. Land Justice. Hill, Michael D. 2021. The Catawba Nation, Treasures in History. Charleston, History Press. Coastal Ecology. Johnson, Walter, 2020. The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis and the Violent History of the United States. New York, Basic Books. Contains critical analysis of Mississippi River Valley conservation conflicts applicable to SC watershed management. Gullah Geechee land stewardship. Pulitzer, William S. 1999. The Gullah People and Their African Heritage. Athens, University of Georgia Press. Methodological Framework. White, Kyle Powys, 2018. Indigenous Science Fiction for the Anthropocene, Ancestral Dystopias and Fantasies of Climate Change Crises. Environment and Planning E. Nature and Space 112, 224-242. Liturgical Resources. Indigenous Environmental Network, 2023. Sacred Earth, Sacred Trust, a decolonial prayer book for climate justice. Bemidji, Minnesota, Ean Press. All photos and media by Sam Harrelson of Locations in South Carolina.